They called her a gold digger. They laughed at her cheap suit. In a Manhattan courtroom, her ex-husband, Richard, a man she once adored, stood up and publicly humiliated her, offering her a settlement so low it was an insult to the 10 years she wasted on him. He thought he had won. He thought she was just a broke, helpless waitress. But Richard made one fatal mistake. He didn't check who her real father was. He didn't know that the woman sitting quietly across from him was the sole heir to an empire he had been trying to impress for years. Watch closely, because the moment the judge reads the new financial affidavit is the most satisfying revenge you will ever see. The air in the courtroom smelled of stale coffee and old wood polish, a scent that Jenna would forever associate with the feeling of suffocation. Outside, the New York rain was hammering against the windows of the Supreme Court of New York County, but inside, the atmosphere was bone-dry and hostile. Jenna huddled into a coat. It was a charcoal trench coat she had bought at a thrift store in Queens 3 years ago. It was clean, but the fabric was worn at the elbows, a detail she tried to hide by keeping her arms crossed tight against her chest. Across the aisle sat Richard. He looked magnificent, in the way a shark looks magnificent right before it bites you. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit from Anderson & Shepherd, the kind that didn't just fit, but seemed to float around his frame. He was whispering something to his lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Beatrice Calloway, who was known in the city as the Butcher of Broadway for how she handled high-stakes divorces. They both chuckled. Richard caught Jenna looking and offered a small, pitying smile. It wasn't a smile of affection. It was the smile you gave a beggar when you didn't have any change. "All rise," the bailiff droned. Judge Arthur P. Holloway entered. He looked tired. It was 3 p.m. on a Friday, and he clearly wanted to be at his country club in Westchester. "Docket number 4409, the clerk announced. "Sterling v. Sterling. Final hearing on spousal support and asset division." Beatrice Calloway stood up, smoothing her silk skirt. "Your Honor, we are here today because Mr. Sterling has been more than generous. Despite the fact that his ex-wife contributed nothing to the growth of Sterling Tech during their 5-year marriage, he has offered a lump sum of $25,000. Frankly, given her current employment status as a barista? Or is it a dog walker now? We believe this is more than sufficient to help her get back on her feet." She paused for effect, turning to look at Jenna with faux sympathy. "We understand that Mrs. Sterling is struggling, but Mr. Sterling's success is a result of his own genius and 80-hour work weeks. It is not a lottery for former spouses to cash in on." Richard nodded solemnly, looking like a aggrieved saint. Jenna's lawyer, a public defender named Jerry, who smelled faintly of egg salad, shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, my client supported Mr. Sterling for years while he built that company. She paid the rent. She bought the groceries. $25,000 is insulting." Richard let out a loud, scoffing laugh. It echoed in the quiet room. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Holloway warned, peering over his glasses. "Apologies, Your Honor," Richard said, standing up. His voice was smooth, practiced. "It's just supported me. She worked at a diner, Your Honor. She made minimum wage. The rent she paid was for a studio apartment in Bushwick that had rats in the walls. I pulled us out of that. I built a $10 million company. And now she wants half. Because she made me toast in the mornings?" He turned to Jenna, his eyes cold and hard. "Jenna, look at yourself. You're wearing the same coat you wore when I left you. You haven't moved on. You haven't achieved anything. Take the money. Buy yourself some new clothes. Maybe get a certification. Stop trying to bleed me dry just because you can't make it on your own." The court stenographer's fingers tapped rhythmically, capturing every humiliating word. Jenna felt the heat rising in her cheeks. She felt small, insignificant. "I just want what's fair, Richard," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "Fair?" Richard laughed again, cruel and sharp. Fair as you walking away with what you came into this marriage with, which, if I recall, was a suitcase full of paperback books and a cat that hated me. You're a waitress, Jenna. You always were, and you always will be. You don't belong in my world." Beatrice Calloway smirked. "Your Honor, can we wrap this up? Mr. Sterling has a flight to Zurich tonight for a meeting with global vanguards. He really doesn't have time to argue over crumbs." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mrs. Sterling, the offer seems practical. New York is an equitable distribution state, but if you cannot prove direct contribution to the business assets, you face an uphill battle. Do you have any evidence to present today that counters Mr. Sterling's valuation?" Jenna looked down at her hands. They were rough from washing dishes at the cafe. She looked at Richard, who was checking his Rolex, a submariner she knew cost more than her annual salary. She thought about the folder in her bag, the one she had received only yesterday, the one that changed everything. She looked at the judge. "Actually, Your Honor," Jenna said, her voice suddenly steady, "I do." Richard rolled his eyes. "Oh God, what is it? A receipt for milk from 2019? "No," Jenna said. She stood up, and for the first time, she didn't hunch her shoulders. She unbuttoned the worn trench coat, revealing a simple black dress underneath. She reached into a tote bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound document stamped with a wax seal. "It's a motion to amend the financial affidavit," Jenna said clearly, "and a request for a recess so that Mr. Sterling's legal team can review my new asset declaration." "Your assets?" Richard scoffed. "Did you find a $10 bill on the sidewalk?" Jenna ignored him. She handed the document to the bailiff, who walked it over to the bench. "You see, Richard," Jenna said, her voice cutting through the room, "you're right. I don't belong in your world. Your world is worth $10 million. She paused, locking eyes with him. "My world is worth $4 billion. To understand the silence that fell over the courtroom, you have to understand the noise that had filled Jenna's life for the past decade. Jenna didn't meet Richard at a gala or a business school mixer. She met him in a laundromat on 4th Street. He was crying. He had shrunk his only suit, and he had an interview at a mid-tier investment firm in an hour. Jenna, then 22 and studying literature, had taken pity on him. She knew how to stretch fabric. She helped him fix the suit, and he got the job. He told her she was his good luck charm. They married 6 months later at a courthouse. No guests. Jenna had no family. Her mother, a reclusive artist named Martha, had died when Gina was 18, leaving her nothing but a storage unit full of unsold paintings and a weirdly heavy antique locket. Jenna never knew her father. Martha had always said it was a summer fling that didn't matter. For the first 3 years it was good. They were poor, but they were a team. Then Richard had his big idea. He wanted to start Sterling Tech, a logistics software company. "It's going to change the world, Jenna," he had said, his eyes feverish. "But I need capital. I need every cent." So Jenna quit her master's degree. She took a double shift at a diner called the Greasy Spoon. She picked up freelance copy editing gigs. Every paycheck she made went into the joint account, and almost instantly it disappeared into server costs, developer fees, and Richard's networking lunches. The change in Richard was slow, insidious. It started with stress. "Why is the apartment so messy?" he would snap when he came home at 10 p.m. "I worked 12 hours today, Richard," she would say gently. "Yeah, flipping burgers. I'm building an empire. There's a difference in mental load, Jenna. Try to keep up." He stopped calling her his good luck charm. He started calling her his anchor, and not in the grounding way. In the way that meant she was dragging him down. By year 4, Sterling Tech began to gain traction. Richard secured a seed round of funding. He hired employees. He leased a glass-walled office in Soho. Did Jenna get to celebrate? No. "You can't come to the launch party," Richard told her one evening, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. "Why not?" Jenna asked, hurt. "I paid for the incorporation fees. I paid for your first suit." "Look at you, Jenna," Richard sneered, gesturing at her jeans and t-shirt. "You don't fit the brand. Investors want to see success. They want to see sophistication. You look like you're about to take a bus to Jersey." He started leaving her behind. He bought a penthouse in Tribeca, but insisted they keep separate bedrooms because he needed space to think. He bought the Ferrari. He started traveling to London, Tokyo, Dubai, and then came the infidelity. It wasn't even hidden. He would come home smelling of expensive perfume. Baccarat Rouge 540, Jenna noted, a scent that cost $300 a bottle. When she confronted him, he laughed. "I have needs, Jenna. I need intellectual stimulation. You read novels. You're simple. I need someone who understands the market." The divorce papers came on her 29th birthday. He served them to her himself. "I'm doing you a favor," he said, handing her a manila envelope along with a cupcake from a bodega. "You're unhappy. I'm bored. Let's end it. I'll give you a few grand. You can move back to Queens and find a nice mechanic or something." He kicked her out of the penthouse that night. She left with 2 suitcases. She had no savings. He had drained the joint account into offshore holdings she couldn't access. For the last 8 months leading up to the trial, Jenna lived in a basement apartment in Astoria. She went back to waitressing. She felt like a failure. She believed everything Richard had said, that she was simple, unlovable, and destined for mediocrity. But the universe works in strange, terrifying ways. 2 days before the final court hearing, Jenna was scrubbing a table at the cafe when a man walked in. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like an old-world butler who had gotten lost in Queens. He wore a heavy wool suit, a bowler hat, and carried a briefcase that looked older than the building. He sat at Jenna's table. "Can I get you a coffee?" Jenna asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you Jenna Martha Miller?" the man asked. His accent was British, clipped and precise. "I use the name Sterling now," she muttered, unfortunately. "But your mother was Martha Miller. The painter?" "Yes," Jenna said, guarding herself. "She passed away 10 years ago. If you're a debt collector, you're late." The man smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile. "I am not a debt collector, my dear. My name is Alistair Thorne. I am the senior executor for the firm Thorne, Weatherby and Associates in London." He placed the briefcase on the table and clicked the gold latches open. "We have been looking for you for a very long time, Jenna. Your mother was difficult to track. She changed her name when she fled England." "Fled?" Jenna frowned. "She was from Ohio." "No," Alistair said softly. "She was from Kensington. She ran away because she fell in love with an artist her father disapproved of. She chose love over money. But her father, he never stopped looking for her. And he never stopped looking for you." Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. "Who was my grandfather?" Alistair pulled out a photograph. It showed a stern-looking man standing next to the Queen of England. He was cutting a ribbon on a massive skyscraper. "His name was Lord Archibald Cavendish," Alistair said, "the steel magnate, the owner of Cavendish Industries. He passed away last week at the age of 92. Jenna stared at the photo. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Cavendish Industries owned shipping lines, steel mills, and half the real estate in London. Richard talked about them constantly. He had a poster of the Cavendish headquarters in his home office. He called Archibald Cavendish a titan. "Lord Cavendish had no other children," Alistair continued. "He disowned your mother when she left, but on his deathbed he had a change of heart. He rewrote his will." Alistair slid a heavy document across the greasy table. "He left it all to you, Jenna. The liquidity, the assets, the title, the portfolio. Everything." Jenna's hand shook as she touched the paper. "How much?" Alistair lowered his voice, though the cafe was empty. "The current valuation of the estate, after taxes, sits at approximately £4.2 billion. That is roughly $5.5 billion US. Jenna stopped breathing. The background noise of the coffee machine faded away. 5.5 billion. There is one condition, Alistair said. You must accept the inheritance in person, and you must assume control of the board. You are not just getting money, Jenna. You are becoming the chairwoman of Cavendish Industries. Jenna looked out the window. She saw her reflection in the glass, the tired eyes, the messy hair, the apron stained with coffee. Then she thought of Richard. She thought of his laugh. She thought of how he called her simple. She looked back at Alistair. Mr. Thorne, she said, a new fire igniting in her chest. I have a court hearing on Friday. My ex-husband is trying to stiff me on a $25,000 settlement. Alistair raised an eyebrow. Is he now? Yes. And he thinks he's a big shot because his company is worth $10 million. Alistair chuckled, a dry, aristocratic sound. $10 million. That's barely the maintenance cost of your grandfather's yacht. Exactly, Jenna said. She reached for the pen. I'll sign. But I need a lawyer, not a public defender. I need a shark. I need someone who can eat Beatrice Calloway for breakfast. Alistair smiled, pulling a cell phone from his pocket. My dear, the Cavendish family retains the services of Holloway, Spector, and Ross. I will have Harvey Ross himself on a plane to New York within the hour. That was the back story. That was the secret in the folder. Back in the courtroom, the silence stretched on. Judge Holloway was staring at Jenna over his glasses. Richard was looking at her like she had grown a second head. 4 billion? Richard sputtered, breaking the silence. Your Honor, she's clearly having a mental breakdown. She's delusional. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice surprisingly sharp. He was looking at the document Jenna had handed him. His eyes were wide. He flipped a page, then another. He looked at the seal, the crest of the High Court of Justice in London. Mr. Sterling, sit down, the judge ordered. But sit down, Judge Holloway barked. He turned his gaze to Jenna. It wasn't a look of annoyance anymore. It was a look of profound respect, bordering on fear. Mrs. Sterling, the judge said, his voice dropping an octave. This document, it appears to be a verified probate order from the United Kingdom, authenticated by the British consulate. Yes, Your Honor, Jenna said, and it lists you as the sole beneficiary of the Cavendish estate? Yes, Your Honor. Richard's lawyer, Beatrice, went pale. She grabbed Richard's arm. Richard, she hissed. Cavendish? Did she say Cavendish? Who cares? Richard snapped. It's fake. If it's real, Beatrice whispered, terror in her eyes. Archibald Cavendish is the man you've been trying to get a meeting with for 3 years. He's the one who controls the global supply chain for your chips. Richard froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Jenna, Richard stammered, his voice cracking. What is this? Jenna turned to him. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She smiled. This, Richard, she said softly, is me moving on. At that moment, the courtroom doors banged open. 3 men in immaculate charcoal suits walked in. They moved with the kind of confidence that comes from billing $2,000 an hour. The man in the lead had silver hair and a jawline that could cut glass. It was Harvey Ross. Your Honor, Harvey boomed, his voice filling the room. Apologies for the tardiness. My plane was delayed. I am entering my appearance as counsel for Mrs. Jenna Cavendish Sterling, and we have a few motions to file regarding Mr. Sterling's adorable little company. Richard slumped into his chair. The nightmare had just begun. The arrival of Harvey Ross changed the molecular density of the courtroom. If Beatrice Calloway was a butcher, Harvey was a neurosurgeon with a scalpel made of diamonds. He didn't just walk in. He glided, flanked by 2 junior associates who looked like they had been bred in a laboratory for the sole purpose of carrying leather briefcases. Beatrice Calloway, usually the loudest person in any room, sat down abruptly. She knew who Harvey Ross was. He didn't handle divorces in Queens. He handled mergers for nations. He had once sued a small country for breach of contract and won the country's national airline as payment. Mr. Ross, Judge Holloway said, adjusting his glasses, his voice dripping with sudden deference. To what do we owe the pleasure? This is a simple marital dissolution case. It was simple, Your Honor, Harvey said, unbuttoning his suit jacket and flashing a smile that was both dazzling and terrifying. Until 10 minutes ago. He walked over to Jenna. He didn't treat her like a pro bono charity case. He bowed his head slightly. Mrs. Sterling, or should I say, Miss Cavendish, my condolences on the passing of your grandfather. The entire firm is at your disposal. Richard sat there, his mouth opening and closing like a goldfish. This is ridiculous, he finally choked out. She's a waitress. She doesn't have money for you. Who's paying you? Harvey turned slowly to look at Richard. He looked at Richard's shoes, then his suit, then his face, dissecting him with a glance. Mr. Sterling, Harvey said, his voice dangerously calm, I am not being paid. I am representing the chairwoman of Cavendish Industries. My fees are irrelevant. However, yours are about to become a significant issue. Harvey turned back to the judge. Your Honor, we are withdrawing the previous financial affidavit submitted by Mrs. Sterling. It is now obsolete. Furthermore, we are filing an immediate motion to freeze the assets of Sterling Tech, pending a forensic audit. Freeze my assets? Richard screamed, jumping to his feet. You can't do that. I have a company to run. I have investors. Sit down, Richard, Beatrice hissed, yanking his sleeve. On what grounds? Judge Holloway asked, though he looked like he was already reaching for his stamp to approve it. On the grounds of fraud, Your Honor, Harvey said smoothly. He snapped his fingers, and one of his associates handed him a blue folder. Mr. Sterling claimed in his sworn statement that Sterling Tech is valued at $10 million. He claimed his ex-wife contributed nothing. However, Harvey opened the folder. It has come to our attention that Sterling Tech relies heavily on a proprietary logistics algorithm, an algorithm that, according to these timestamps on the original code, was written on a laptop registered to one Jenna Miller. The room went dead silent. Jenna looked up, surprised. She had forgotten. I did some coding for him. In the beginning, when we couldn't afford a developer, I learned Python to help him fix the bugs. She debugged a few lines, Richard shouted, sweat beading on his forehead. She didn't write the core code. According to the metadata, Harvey continued, ignoring Richard, Jenna wrote 40% of the founding architecture. Under New York law, that makes her not just a spouse, but a co-founder, which means she is entitled to 50% of the company's future valuation, not just the current cash on hand. Harvey leaned in on the podium, and since Mr. Sterling failed to disclose this intellectual property contribution, he has committed perjury. We aren't just asking for half, Your Honor. We are suing for full punitive damages. Ryan. Beatrice Calloway stood up, her hands shaking. Your Honor, my client requests a recess. We need to regroup. Granted, the judge said immediately. Court is adjourned for 48 hours. As the gavel banged, the room erupted into noise. Reporters who had been dozing in the back row suddenly woke up, sensing blood in the water. Richard ignored his lawyer. He pushed past Beatrice and marched straight up to Jenna. He stopped inches from her face. Jenna, he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate tone he used to use when he wanted sex or forgiveness. Babe, look at me. Jenna looked at him. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the pull. She didn't feel the fear. She just saw a man in a suit that was trying too hard. This has gone too far, Richard whispered, trying to grab her hand. Jenna pulled back. Cavendish, seriously. If you have billions, why are you trying to destroy my little company? You don't need the money. Let's go get dinner. Let's talk about this. We were a team once, right? Remember the laundromat? It was a tactical error. Jenna's eyes hardened. I remember the laundromat, Richard. I remember fixing your suit. And I remember you telling me last week that I was destined to be a waitress forever. She leaned in, her voice cold as ice. "I don't want your money, Richard. I have enough money to buy your entire neighborhood. I'm not doing this for the cash." "Then why?" Richard pleaded. "Why are you doing this?" Jenna smiled, and it was the first time Richard realized that the sweet, quiet girl he married had died the day he served her divorce papers. "I'm doing it to teach you a lesson about value," she said. "You threw me away because you thought I had no value. Now I'm going to show you exactly how expensive I can be." She turned to Harvey. "Mr. Ross, get the car." "Already waiting, Ma'am," Harvey said. Jenna walked out of the courtroom, the tails of her trench coat billowing behind her. Richard watched her go, the color draining from his face. "Richard," Beatrice said, walking up behind him. She sounded defeated. "I can't represent you anymore." Richard spun around. "What? You can't quit. We have a hearing in 2 days." "I can't go up against Holloway, Spector, and Ross," Beatrice said, packing her bag. "And I certainly can't go up against the Cavendish estate. Do you know who they are? They own the building we're standing in, Richard. They own the bank your company uses. You're not fighting an ex-wife anymore. You're fighting God." She snapped her briefcase shut. "My bill will be in the mail. Good luck. You're going to need it." The next morning, the sun rose over Manhattan, but inside the offices of Sterling Tech, it felt like midnight. The office was a monument to Richard's ego. Located on the 40th floor of a glass tower in Hudson Yards, it was all sleek lines, chrome, and expensive espresso machines. Usually it was buzzing with the energy of 20 overworked coders. Today, it was silent. Richard sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. The stock ticker for his competitors was green. Everything else was red. His COO, a nervous man named Greg, who wore vests that were too tight, burst into the room. "Richard, we have a problem," Greg panted. "I know we have a problem, Greg," Richard snapped, rubbing his temples. "My ex-wife is suing me. I know." "No," Greg said, shaking his head frantically. "Not the lawsuit. It's the supply chain, the shipment of microprocessors from Taiwan. It's been held at customs in London." "What?" Richard stood up. "We need those processors for the Global Vanguard's demo on Friday. If we don't have the prototypes, the deal is dead." "I know," Greg yelled. "I called the shipping company, Royal Atlantic Freight. They said there's a compliance hold on our account. Call them back. Offer them double." "I did. They said money isn't the issue. They said the order came from the parent company." Richard froze. "Who owns Royal Atlantic Freight?" Greg looked at his tablet. He scrolled down. He went pale. It's a subsidiary of Cavendish Industries." Richard sank back into his chair. He felt like the walls were closing in. "She's blocking my shipments," he whispered. "She's strangling the company." "There's more," Greg said, his voice trembling. "The lease, for this office. What about it?" "The building management just emailed. They're invoking a clause in our contract. Apparently they're doing emergency structural renovations on the 40th floor. We have to vacate by Friday." "They can't do that," Richard roared. "They can if the building owner says so," Greg said. "Guess who owns the building, Richard?" Richard didn't need to guess. He grabbed a bottle of scotch from his desk drawer and poured a glass, his hands shaking so hard he spilled half of it. She was dismantling his life, piece by piece. She wasn't just suing him. She was erasing him. "Get out," Richard told Greg. "But the demo." "Get out," Greg ran. Richard sat alone in the silence. He looked at the view of the city, a city he thought he had conquered. Now it looked like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Jenna. "Meeting 2 p.m. Your office. Don't be late." Richard stared at the phone. He wanted to throw it through the window. He wanted to scream, but he knew he had no choice. At 1:55 p.m., the elevator doors to the 40th floor pinged open. Richard was waiting in the lobby, trying to look composed. He had changed his shirt, put on fresh cologne, and practiced his CEO face. He needed to be strong. He needed to negotiate. But when Jenna stepped out of the elevator, Richard's CEO face crumbled. Gone was the thrift store trench coat. Gone were the scuffed boots. Jenna was wearing a white power suit that looked like it had been tailored by angels. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, was blown out in sleek, shining waves. She wore simple diamond studs, but Richard, having learned about jewelry in his desperate attempts to fit in with the rich, knew they were flawless, at least 3 carats each. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like a queen visiting her subjects. Flanking her were 2 bodyguards, and of course, Harvey Ross. "Hello, Richard," Jenna said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the hesitation that used to define her. "Jenna," Richard choked out, "you look different." "I look like myself," she corrected. "Shall we?" She didn't wait for him to lead the way. She walked past him, straight into his conference room, and sat at the head of the table, his chair. Richard followed, feeling like a guest in his own office. He sat on the side, while Harvey and the bodyguards stood against the wall. "You're ruining me," Richard said, skipping the pleasantries. "The chips? The lease? You're destroying Sterling Tech." Jenna placed her hands on the table. "I'm not destroying it, Richard. I'm auditing it. There's a difference. You're killing the Global Vanguard's deal." "The Global Vanguard's deal was never going to happen," Jenna said coolly. Richard blinked. "What? Of course it was. They loved the pitch." "They loved the pitch," Jenna agreed. "But Global Vanguards is a venture capital firm that focuses on sustainable tech. Their due diligence process is rigorous." She slid a folder across the table. "I had Harvey run a background check on your finances, the real ones, not the ones you showed the court." Richard felt the sweat trickling down his back. "You've been cooking the books, Richard," Jenna said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "inflating user numbers, hiding debt in offshore shells. If Global Vanguard saw this, they wouldn't just pull the deal. They'd call the SEC. None." Richard put his head in his hands. "It was just bridge financing. I was going to pay it back once the deal went through. I just needed time." "You always need time," Jenna said. "And you always use other people to buy it. You used me for 5 years. You used your employees. Now you're trying to use investors. So what do you want?" Richard looked up, his eyes red. "You want to turn me in? Send me to jail?" "I could," Jenna said thoughtfully. "Harvey says we have enough for a criminal indictment. Fraud, perjury, embezzlement." Harvey nodded from the corner. "Minimum 10 years, Mr. Sterling. Federal." Richard started to sob. It was a pathetic, gasping sound. "Please, Jenna, please. I built this from nothing. It's all I have." Jenna watched him cry. She remembered the nights she had cried herself to sleep while he was out networking with 22-year-old models. She remembered how he looked at her in court 2 days ago. "I'm not going to send you to jail, Richard," Jenna said. Richard looked up, hope flaring in his eyes. "You're not?" "No," she said. "That would be too easy. And frankly, I don't want the bad press attached to the Cavendish name." She signaled to Harvey. He placed a contract on the table. "I am offering to buy Sterling Tech," Jenna said. Richard stared at the paper. You want to buy it?" "Yes, I'm buying the debt, the assets, and the IP. I'm folding it into the Cavendish Technology Division." "For how much?" Richard asked, his greed momentarily flickering back to life. "It was valued at 10 million. "That was before the audit revealed it was a house of cards," Jenna said. She took a pen and wrote a number on the bottom of the contract. She spun it around so he could see. Richard looked at the number. $1. $1? Richard shrieked. "Are you insane?" "Plus," Jenna added, "I will assume the debt. I will pay off the loans you took out, so you don't go to prison. I will save your reputation. You walk away clean. No jail, no debt. But I get nothing," Richard yelled. 5 years of work, and I get $1. "You get your freedom," Jenna said hard, "and you get to keep the Ferrari. Although I hear the maintenance on those is a bitch. She stood up. You have 5 minutes to sign, Richard. If you don't, Harvey calls the SEC, and I release the hold on the microchips to your competitors. Richard looked at the contract. He looked at Harvey, who was checking his watch. He looked at Jenna. He realized, with a crushing finality, that he had never really known her. He had lived with her, slept with her, but he had never seen her strength. He had mistaken kindness for weakness. With a trembling hand, Richard picked up the pen. He signed his name. Jenna didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded to Harvey, who picked up the contract. "Get out of my building, Richard," Jenna said. "But my things." "Security will mail them to you," she said, turning her back on him to look out the window at the city that was now hers. "Goodbye, Richard." Richard Sterling walked out of the glass office, past the terrified employees, and into the elevator. When he hit the lobby, he reached into his pocket and found a single, crumpled dollar bill. He stared at it. It was all he was worth. If the New York courtroom was a battlefield, the boardroom of Cavendish Industries in London was a gladiator arena where the lions wore pinstripes. 3 weeks after decimating Richard, Jenna stepped off a Gulfstream G650 at Heathrow Airport. The rain here was different than in New York. It felt older, heavier. A convoy of black Range Rovers was waiting on the tarmac. Miss Cavendish, the head of security, a massive man named Pritchard, nodded as he opened the door. "Welcome home." Home. The word felt strange in her mouth. Her home had been a basement in Astoria. Now it was a sprawling estate in Kensington and a seat at the head of a table that controlled global shipping lanes. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. the next morning. Jenna spent the night studying. She didn't sleep in the silk sheets of the master suite. She sat at the kitchen island, drinking instant coffee, old habits die hard, surrounded by stacks of financial reports, employee manifestos, and efficiency audits. She was looking for the rot, and she found it. The next morning, she walked into the Cavendish headquarters at Canary Wharf. The building was a monolith of steel and glass, piercing the grey sky. The boardroom was on the 80th floor. 12 men sat around a mahogany table long enough to land a plane on. They were the old guard. Men who had served under her grandfather. Men who believed that women belonged at charity luncheons, not in executive chairs. At the head of the opposition was Charles Montgomery. Charles was the interim CEO. He was 60, silver-haired, and possessed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had expected to inherit the empire. He had spent 30 years grooming himself for the role, only to be usurped by a waitress from Queens. "Miss Cavendish," Charles said as she entered, not bothering to stand. "So good of you to join us. We were just discussing the transition. We have a generous stipend package prepared for you. It will allow you to live comfortably while the adults handle the business." The other men chuckled. It was a club, and she wasn't a member. Jenna didn't sit down. She walked slowly around the table, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She let the silence stretch until the chuckles died out. "Comfortably," Jenna repeated, stopping behind Charles's chair. "That's an interesting word, Charles, because looking at the Q3 reports, comfortable seems to be the problem." "I beg your pardon?" Charles stiffened. Jenna tossed a file onto the table. It slid across the mahogany and stopped perfectly in the center. "I spent last night reading the shipping manifests for the North Sea route," Jenna said, her voice projecting clearly. "Can anyone explain to me why we are paying 20% above market rate for fuel from a supplier called Helios Energy?" The room went quiet. Charles shifted in his seat. "That is a trusted vendor. We have a long-standing relationship." "I'm sure you do," Jenna said coldly, "because Helios Energy is owned by your brother-in-law, Charles." A gasp went around the room. "And it's not just the fuel," Jenna continued, circling the table like a shark. "The insurance contracts, funneled through a firm owned by Mr. Henderson's wife." She pointed to a sweating man on the left. "The real estate maintenance fees?" double the industry standard, paid to a shell company in the Caymans linked to you, Mr. Davies." She stopped at the head of the table. "You assumed I was a dumb waitress," Jenna said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You thought I would take the money and go shopping. But you forgot one thing about waitresses, Charles." "And what is that?" Charles sneered, though his face was pale. "We know how to count change," Jenna said, "and we know when we're being shorted." She pressed a button on the intercom. "Security, please come in." The doors opened. Pritchard and 4 guards entered. "You can't do this." Charles stood up, his face purple. "The bylaws." "I own 51% of the voting stock," Jenna interrupted. "I am the bylaws. Charles Montgomery, you are fired for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. Mr. Henderson, Mr. Davies, you're out too." "This is an outrage," Charles shouted as the guards moved towards him. "You'll ruin this company. You don't know how this world works." "I know exactly how it works," Jenna said, sitting in the chairman's seat for the first time. "It works for me now." As Charles was dragged out of the room, shouting threats, Jenna looked at the remaining 9 board members. They were terrified. They sat up straighter than they had in years. "Now," Jenna said, opening her notebook, "let's talk about renewable energy. I want to pivot the fleet to hydrogen by 2030. Who has ideas?" For the first time in a decade, the boardroom of Cavendish Industries didn't smell like cigars and stagnation. It smelled like fear and progress. 2 years passed. Jenna didn't just run Cavendish Industries. She revolutionized it. She became a media darling, the iron waitress of Wall Street. She graced the cover of Forbes, Time, and Vogue. She turned the sluggish, corrupt giant into a modern, ethical powerhouse. Her net worth doubled. But the real test of her transformation came on the first Monday in May, the Met Gala. It was the most exclusive event of the year. The theme was Gilded Glamour. Jenna was the co-chair. She arrived on the red carpet wearing a custom Alexander McQueen gown made of gold mesh that looked like liquid fire. Flashbulbs erupted like a supernova. Reporters screamed her name. "Jenna, Jenna, over here! Who are you wearing? Jenna, is it true you're dating the Prince of Denmark?" She smiled, the practiced, dazzling smile of a woman who knows her worth. On her arm was not a prince, but Dr. Lucas Bennett, a brilliant, kind-hearted pediatric surgeon she had met at a charity fundraiser. He held her hand like it was precious, not because she was rich, but because he loved her. They walked up the famous stairs, entering the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and power. "Champagne, madame?" Jenna turned to grab a flute from a passing tray. She froze. The waiter holding the tray was wearing a white tuxedo jacket that was slightly too large. His hair was thinning. His face was lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from working double shifts on your feet. It was Richard. Their eyes locked. For a moment, the noise of the gala faded. The laughter, the music, the clinking of crystal. It all vanished. Richard looked at Jenna. He took in the gold dress, the diamonds, the way the light seemed to bend around her. Then he looked at Lucas, who was handsome, and looked at Jenna with total adoration. Then Jenna looked at Richard. She saw the man who had mocked her for being a waitress, the man who had told her she had no value. Now he was serving drinks to the very people he had once desperately tried to impress. "Richard," Jenna said softly. Richard's hand trembled. The champagne glasses rattled. "Jenna," he whispered. He looked like he wanted to run, to dissolve into the floor. I work for the catering company now. The event planner. She gave me a shot." "I see," Jenna said. There was no anger in her heart anymore. There was no need for revenge. Life, in its brutal irony, had taken care of that. "I saw the news," Richard said, his voice cracking. "About the company. You did good." "I did," Jenna said. "I'm sorry," Richard blurted out. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Jenna, for everything. I was a fool." Lucas stepped forward, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right, darling?" Jenna looked at Richard one last time. She saw a ghost, a lesson. "Yes, Lucas," Jenna said, turning back to her fiancé. "Everything is perfect. I just bumped into someone I used to know." She turned to Richard. She didn't offer him money. She didn't try to humiliate him. She simply treated him with the dignity he had never shown her. "The champagne is lovely," she said. "Thank you." She took a glass. "Good luck, Richard." She walked away, her gold dress trailing behind her, disappearing into the crowd of billionaires and stars. Richard stood there, watching her go. He watched the woman he had thrown away become the queen of the ball. A guest tapped him on the shoulder. "Hey, waiter, we're dry over here. Less dreaming, more pouring." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." He turned back to the crowd, disappearing into the background. Just another servant in a world he could no longer touch. The story could have easily ended at the Met Gala. It would have been a perfect, cinematic ending. The villain humbled, the heroine triumphant, the diamonds sparkling under the flashbulbs. But for Jaina, that moment, while satisfying, was fleeting. It was candy. It tasted sweet, but it didn't nourish her. Real revenge, Jenna had learned, wasn't about watching someone else fall. It was about climbing so high that they simply became invisible. 5 years after the court case that changed her life, Jenna found herself back in Queens. She wasn't passing through in a limousine with tinted windows. She was standing on the sidewalk of 4th Street, the pavement cracked and stained with chewing gum, just as it had been a decade ago. But the corner had changed. Where the spin cycle laundromat once stood, the very place where she had met Richard, where she had sewn his button and sealed her fate, there was now a modern, 3-story structure made of warm brick and inviting glass. It didn't look like a corporate office. It looked like a home. Above the entrance, a modest bronze plaque read, "The Martha Miller Institute for Financial Independence." It wasn't just a shelter. It was a fortress for the forgotten. Jenna stood in the private office on the top floor, looking out at the subway tracks rattling in the distance. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. On her desk sat a framed photograph of her mother, Martha. For years, Jenna had looked at that photo and seen a woman who had lost everything for love. Now she saw a woman who had chosen freedom over shackles. "Miss Cavendish?" Jenna turned. Standing in the doorway was her assistant, but behind her stood a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 23. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for the November chill, and she clutched a plastic bag full of papers as if it contained the nuclear codes. Her eyes were red-rimmed, darting around the room with the terrified hypervigilance of someone who is used to being yelled at. "This is Chloe," the assistant said softly. "She's the first walk-in for the legal clinic today. She didn't want to speak to the intake officers. She said she knows your story." Jenna nodded to her assistant to leave them. She walked around the desk, an antique oak piece that cost more than Richard's Ferrari, and sat in the chair next to Chloe. "I'm not a lawyer, Chloe," Jenna said gently, "but I know a few good ones." "He said I wouldn't get anything," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "He said I'm just a receptionist. He said he made all the money, and if I leave, he'll make sure I starve." The words hung in the air, ancient and familiar. The script never changed, only the actors did. Jenna reached out and took Chloe's hand. It was cold. "He's lying," Jenna said, her voice fierce and steady. "He says that because his power depends on your fear. The moment you stop being afraid, he becomes just a man, and usually a very small one." Jenna stood up and walked to the wall safe. She punched in a code and pulled out a checkbook. She didn't write a check, though. She pulled out a business card for Holloway, Spector, and Ross. "Go to this address. Ask for Harvey Ross. Tell him Jenna sent you. Tell him to bring the Gladiator Protocol." Chloe looked at the card, then up at Jenna. "Why? Why would you help me?" "Because," Jenna smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I used to be you, and someone needs to balance the scales." An hour later, Jenna stepped out onto the podium set up in front of the building. A crowd had gathered. It wasn't the glossy crowd of the Met Gala. There were no designers, no dukes, no influencers. It was the neighborhood. It was women in nurses' scrubs, grandmothers holding grocery bags, young students with backpacks. The press was there too, local news mostly. They wanted the soundbite. They wanted the "Billionaire Heiress returns to Roots" headline. Jenna adjusted the microphone. The wind caught her hair, no longer the messy bun of a stressed waitress, but the blowout of a woman who owned her time. 5 years ago, Jenna began, her voice echoing down the street. I sat in a courtroom not far from here. I was told that my value was zero. I was told that because I didn't build the company, because I didn't wear the suit, my contribution didn't matter. I was told that I was a passenger in my own life. She paused, looking at the spot where the washing machines used to be. We are taught that wealth is the only metric of success. But money is just energy. It has no morality. It can be used to silence people, or it can be used to give them a voice. My grandfather left me an empire of steel and shipping. He built things that carried cargo across oceans. But my mother, she left me the ability to carry myself. Jenna looked directly into the camera lens, knowing that somewhere, in a small apartment or a break room, Richard might be watching. This building stands on the ruins of my biggest mistake, she declared. I built it here to remind every woman in this city that you can burn your life to the ground and still build a castle from the ashes. You are not your husband's property. You are not your boss's overhead. You are the architect. And if they lock the doors, you buy the building. The applause that erupted wasn't polite golf claps. It was a roar. It was the sound of 100 people feeling seen for the first time. As Jenna stepped down, she saw a figure standing in the shadows of the alleyway. It was Alistair Thorne. The old executor was leaning on his umbrella, looking out of place in Queens, yet perfectly at home in the presence of power. Jenna walked over to him. A bit dramatic, don't you think? Alistair teased, his eyes twinkling. Buying the laundromat? Harvey nearly had a stroke trying to secure the zoning permits. It felt necessary, Jenna said, watching the women flood into the new centre. Your grandfather was a ruthless man, Jenna, Alistair said quietly, watching the scene. He conquered markets. He crushed competitors. He died with billions, but he died alone. Alistair tipped his bowler hat to her. You have done something he never could. You turned his cold, hard cash into something warm. You didn't just inherit his money, my dear. You redeemed it. Jenna looked back at the building one last time. She thought of the $25,000 settlement Richard had offered her. She thought of the billions in the trust fund. None of it felt as heavy or as real as the weight of the key in her pocket, the key to a door that she had opened, all on her own. Come on, Alistair, Jenna said, linking her arm through his. Let's go. I have a board meeting in London at 8 a.m., and I'm going to make them pay for childcare for every employee in the fleet. Heaven help them, Alistair chuckled. They walked down the street, past the bodega, past the subway station, moving forward, never looking back. And that is the true end of Jenna's journey. She didn't just get rich, she got even, and then she got good. She turned the sight of her lowest moment into a beacon of hope for others. Richard serves drinks, but Jenna serves justice. It just goes to show, never underestimate the person standing quietly in the corner. They might just own the building you're standing in. If you loved this story, please smash that like button. It helps the algorithm find more people who need to hear this. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. And tell me in the comments, if you inherited $5 billion today, what is the first thing you would do? I'll be reading your answers. Thanks for watching.